Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 1 p.m. Central Time Track A slot, Wargaming when war is not the answer, something we hope the answer tends not to be. Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ruby E. Booth, a cybersecurity researcher specializing in the interaction between human behavior and cybersecurity. Her research includes work on hacker motivation, InfoSec, culture, and the effect of security breaches on user behavior. She has a PhD in business administration with a concentration in MIS. Dr. Booth is a principal member of the technical staff at Sandia National Laboratory, where she serves as a national security systems analyst and cybersecurity subject matter expert. Her areas of interest include cyber risk management, consequence assessment, and cyber deterrence investment strategy. Dr. Booth, I turn it over to you.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for being here. I am delighted. This is my first connection, so I'm very happy to be here. Today we will be talking about other applications for wargaming. And so if we can get the slides on, I'll get us started. Excellent. So as I said, the topic of this talk is wargame application for things outside of actually wargaming, and particularly here we're going to look at multi-purpose collective conflict resolution games. What I'm not going to be doing is taking us through a bunch of different kinds of collective conflict resolution games. Instead, I'm going to talk about some of the principles of wargaming, how we approach it at the Sandia Labs. Again, as the little byline just said, my opinions here are my own. I'm not speaking for the lab, I'm speaking based on my experience. I have kind of an unusual background in wargaming. I came from a hobby game background before coming to work for the National Lab. So I've worked for over a decade in large-scale interactive games at convention settings, and I'm a cybersecurity researcher, as the bio mentioned. So I come at this from, I think, a little bit of a different angle, and I'm hoping that will allow me to provide some insights. I did a lot of this work with Josh Letchford and the Pegasus gaming group at Sandia National Labs, and so I want to give shout out to them and thanks for the collaboration. So moving to my next slide, if I can get it to work. There we go. So taking us through the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about wargaming as a data generation process. I'm going to talk to you about the Ascent game that we developed for a pilot version of for NATO. We're going to talk about how to motivate players without an external aggressor. So how to design games where you don't have a big bad, or it's not the area control that we might be more accustomed to. I'm going to talk about possible contexts that we can apply this work to, and supportive mechanics that can kind of serve this goal. I welcome questions throughout the presentation, so anything that you're interested in or curious about, please let me know. All right, so first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about wargaming as a data generation process. And wargames of a variety of sorts can be data generation processes. TTX, these are traditional wargaming in that sense, can be used to generate data about possible conflict resolution, about group dynamics, things of that sort. We can also use it in analytical wargaming, which is what a lot of our focus at the labs is on. Basically, one of the great strengths, as I'm sure you know, of the games is that they can simulate scenarios at the edges of our understanding. So we can capture diverse scenarios with games much more diverse than is easy to capture in many other ways. Games are incredibly versatile. We can change out our rule sets. We can change out our skins. So once we have a stable gaming platform, there's a lot of flexibility that we have, and that's wonderful. That allows us to apply these tools to unusual contexts, to places where it would be too challenging or expensive to use another tool. They're relatively low cost relative to military exercises. Now, I know that within the community, we've had some conversations about the fact that that they can be high cost for, say, an academic setting, particularly if you're developing a game, in software, or you're developing a game with complex boards where you want to produce several of them. That can be expensive. But relative to military exercises, war games are a bargain. Even gigantic war games, if they don't involve actual military exercises, are relatively affordable comparatively. They also have relatively small impacts to reputation. So one of the things that we always have to think about when we're doing conflict research is whether or not our research itself is going to have a negative penalty. Now, I know within our community, we do have stories about this person playing in this way, and you'll hear a tale or two from time to time. But overall, people playing a war game, it's much less of a reputation loss compared, again, to military exercises or worse, to actual conflict, right? Testing a military strategy live and in color has very different costs and very different reputational impacts. We can also recruit from a diverse participant pool, and that is really important as we're trying to get different perspectives. That's a great strength of our method. We can bring in people from all sorts of spaces and contexts. Even in classified games, we can bring people across different branches of the military, different settings, different groups of allies, and we can really come up with a diverse participant pool that gives us the ability to test questions about, like, cultural influence on conflict, or different strategies that might arise from different training backgrounds. So that's a useful and an important part of wargaming. Game design itself can provide scenario stability so that we can test we can vary our independent variables to test certain dependent variables around some kind of context that, it's really hard to capture in the real world, right? Where outside of a game setting. So I really think that once we get stable game design tools, either as an individual organization where you've made some games, you have some background, you can vary those games across different contexts, or as a community, if we start to develop tools with sort of plug and play options around different concepts. So those are all the pros, right? And you're here, so I know that you know some of these, but I'm kind of setting this up around what games can do, why they're strong, and then how we can expand their use, taking these strengths into new areas. Cons, there's a lot of external criticism of wargaming, particularly in academic communities, around the ideas that scenarios may lack validity, and that the game dynamics themselves lack credibility. So there's this idea that that people don't play games the way they actually act in real life. There's a growing body of research that shows that people do commit to games in a meaningful way, that when they're engaged in games, they play their strategies, they develop strategies to play to the best of their abilities. But the fact that we have largely untested credibility in some spaces, particularly around analytical and experimental war games, is an opportunity for us to do those tests, to figure out what our laboratory effects are, and to really dive into the rigor of our field. So that's very exciting. It's exciting to be in a period where wargaming is really flourishing. I mean, there's sort of a wargaming renaissance at the moment, and it's wonderful to see. I would advise that we move forward and address these problems by facing them head on, identifying where our gaps are, and addressing them in that way. I say here that there's a con, which it has a high cost. I know I said over there that it has a low cost, but the point that I'm making is actually that these are relative. So relative to military exercises, war games have a low cost. Relative to surveys or even simple model design, they have a high cost, and that's absolutely true. And one of the ways that we may be able to work on that as an organization, as a larger community, is to make the wargaming wargaming design tools available, in open source fashion. And so that's something that we can mitigate as a community. But it is a downside, right? There's some kinds of wargaming work that are just difficult for other groups to access, groups with less resources. there can be a challenge to recruit expert players. And this, again, is something that as the wargaming community expands, it's not all going to be groups like national labs or, or military groups where we have access to expert participants. And so that's something that I think we need to be mindful of as a community as we move into other areas. How can we make these things available to people doing rigorous research outside of our tiny space? You can have uncertainty about players' motivation. I would argue that that's true in the real world, but this is a concern that people have brought up around wargaming. So as we move into other areas, we'll need to be mindful of that and find robustness checks around it. And then finally, game design can drive atypical behaviors just as a kind of innate feature of game design, right? We have an unusual toolkit, and sometimes that results in things like gamers mode where people will win at any cost, and that's not ideal. So we'll need to explore some of those things. But that's kind of the general setup for what I mean by wargaming as a data generating process. We can create data. It has pros, it has cons, but I think it's a very strong method, as obviously y'all do as well, since you're here at Connections. So what about wargaming as what about analytical wargaming? So analytical wargaming is, of course, a subset of wargaming in general, and it has benefits around that are unique to it. So first of all, it provides an incredibly versatile laboratory. So the idea with analytical wargames, and specifically with experimental wargames within the analytical wargame set, is the idea that we can use a science-based experimental gaming approach to create large data sets that explore issues with a higher level of realism than, say, a survey might, because people are going to be more engaged and more, or at least our argument is that people are more engaged and more invested, and that we get to see interaction between people in a way that's quite difficult to do in any other kind of format. So we have this incredibly important new tool, and it fits within our other tools, right? So qualitative games, the sort of traditional TTX, feeds into analytical war games, right? So we can take the sort of initial stages, the qualitative games can then shape our analytical games, and our analytical games can in turn shape, can be inputs into models and simulation. And that's actually, coming from a background outside of wargaming, it's actually quite familiar, right? If you're doing any kind of research in the social sciences, that's generally how we build theory, right? We start with a theory, we test it by interviewing people, by going and doing observations, and then we move into some kind of more rigorous space, and then not more rigorous. Qualitative research is rigorous. I'm actually a qualitative researcher by training, so I need to be careful with my words there. But into a more quantitative space. And then finally, we can move them into models and simulations, which can identify edge cases, and then that can take us back to the top of the loop as we find edge cases and create theories about them. So this is wonderful, right? This is a great space to be in within wargaming. Analytical wargaming is a useful tool. It's not the only tool, just as wargaming is a useful tool in a social scientist's toolkit, but not the only one. As I've mentioned, on the previous slide, laboratory effects within our field need study. And finally, we have a limited pipeline of experimental wargame designers. We have a limited pipeline of wargame designers, full stop. And within that, we have an even smaller set of people who have training to do, or familiarity enough to do experimental wargame design. And so as I make the argument over the rest of this presentation that we should move out into other areas, and apply this not just to actual war, but to other contexts, we're going to need to improve our pipeline, and we're going to not have enough people to go around. But that's a good problem to have, right? The need to train more people to do our method, because our method can be applied in a lot of places, is a good problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a game that we designed. Ascent was a game of consensus. It was a game that we developed as a pilot version of for NATO's Allied Command Transformation Group. And so we were incredibly fortunate to get that opportunity, and the focus was on NATO consensus making. So if you're not familiar with NATO consensus making, it is an unusual process, and you can see the steps of it over here on the right. Basically, any NATO member can essentially has a veto, um, and to do anything, NATO has to go through. Well, to do any sort of military actions, right? NATO has to go through a number of steps to get consensus at each step. And adding to that complexity, you don't have to voice your objection out loud. You can give your objection in private to the Secretary General. So it's this very unusual process by which there's sort of, oh, so sorry, by which there is kind of sub rosa conflict. But we were asked to encapsulate this within a game, and so our design employed both military and non-military crisis scenarios, and it was designed to permit the exploration of decision-making dynamics in NATO states. So to do that, we had to balance a couple of game functions. So the first function is assent as practice, right? As I said, it was a complicated design, system that we were trying to model. The consent process has many, many steps. Even the graphic on the side there is a fairly condensed description of it that omits a number of subcommittees and dynamics between those. So we wanted to allow people to practice consensus making under crisis-like conditions. That was the ask from our clients. But we also wanted to use assent as an experiment to allow escalation and de-escalation in order to look at how certain variables, when altered, would affect escalation and de-escalation. And so doing that was a complicated balance, right? Because on the one hand, we want to have them practice consensus in a meaningful way. So the tool needed to facilitate small, frequent group interaction, which is something that is part of the NATO consensus process. But we had this constraint. The consensus process was really complicated. And we also, wanted to minimize complexity over on the other side, right? Because we wanted to use this as an experiment. And when things get too complicated, it can dilute actual effects that are present, because people's strategic decisions can be, people can sometimes fail to make strategic decisions well, because the games are so complex that they don't really see the strategy. And so, we wanted to do that balance, and we'll have a talk later in the week about the Wargamers trilemma, which is this concept that we're bringing up and bringing out and hoping to publish. We've got an art book chapter under review about, but basically this idea that there's trade-offs within games, and there are specific kinds of trade-offs. So this was something we were balancing within this this game design. And then we also, I just want to make a short distinction here between practice and training. This was a practice game. This was not a training game, and I say that because we weren't teaching them the consent process. They already knew it. So we weren't training them up from, there wasn't scaffolding. We didn't teach them from the ground up. The assumption was that they already understood the consensus process, but they were going to practice what they already knew to become more familiar with it. And so, in that practice, they would get, the participants would get practice, and then also our NATO sponsors would get data generated to create an analytical model of crisis on-ramps and off-ramps. And there, we wanted that model to be applicable, to be generalizable outside of just the NATO consensus space. So it was an interesting challenge. And there are other talks about the game itself that you're welcome to go to at other times during the connections. But one of the things that we found that was really interesting was that we could have developed Ascent entirely without adversaries. So the qualitative data collection around the consensus process actually showed us that the NATO participants were frequently trading around internal dynamics. So it wasn't just that they were trading in response to an external crisis, though of course that is an important part of NATO. That's obviously a central aspect of NATO structure. But even if we left off things, like you can see this red card sort of hidden. The border incursion card needed a military response in order to be successful, but we had other victory conditions or other scenario outcomes that didn't need that. It needed joint collaboration, but not a military decision. And so those could be something as lighthearted as a reputational event like a World's Fair, or something as serious and conflict related as refugees fleeing from conflict zones needing relocation and support. And so we realized that we could make an entire version of this game that allowed for scenarios with no external aggressors. And that was an interesting concept and sort of led to this talk, because there's this idea of oh, wait, we can use these war games to address pretty much any kind of problem that has to do with human interaction. So on that note, there are a lot of possible contexts for the games that we make. And the way that I see games is that games are interaction sets. So they can be employed in any context requiring human interaction. Well, what do we mean by that, right? So if a game can be used anywhere, where are some places that we might use it? Well, we do use games in other spaces, right? We use games when we're doing penetration testing in a cyber environment. We do TTXs in business, in corporate boardrooms where they talk about strategy, and there are games designed around strategy. But the wargaming community, obviously, we've been very focused on war because it's in the name, and that's our background. But there are areas that have to do with war and with conflict and with international relations that aren't war related, right? They're either games in peacetime, they're games before or after a conflict. And so I began to think, we began to discuss contexts that we could apply our wargaming chops to contexts that would be useful, but that aren't that. So contexts where data are scarce. Cyber threat sharing is a good example of this. Novel policy creation, anytime that you want to do something that's actually new. Innovation in emerging technology spaces. All of these things are spaces where we don't have a lot of data, right? So we have ideas in the cyber realm about what threat sharing might look like, particularly threat sharing across, between countries, between allies, threat sharing between not necessarily adversary nations, but non-allied nations. This idea of sort of greater security, raising all boats in a security space when it comes to cyber, is something that we've discussed as a field in the cyber security international community has had conversations about whether or not this would actually be beneficial, but it's hard to study because we don't do it in a meaningful way at the scale that's sometimes been suggested. And so this is an area where we could create a game to test. Novel policy creation. So you can imagine creating a policy and then seeing how, developing a game to test and see how that policy compares to another policy in terms of how people react to it. People who are making rational choices, but are still human, right? Because so much of the brilliance of wargaming research is this idea that we can capture both the rational and irrational side of people, because we can capture the rational in terms of victory conditions and things of that sort, but we can capture a little bit of that emotional and irrational, reputational driven behavior through the interaction between players. And innovation in emerging technology spaces, you can see, you can lay those out. I mean, we see that even in hobby games, right? Who doesn't remember Civilization's science tree, right? And technology development tree. And so there's definitely an opportunity here for us to create games around these technology spaces that would be really meaningful. Contexts where theories are in conflict. So one of this, and I know I'm using a lot of cyber examples, but again, I'm a cybersecurity researcher. Cyber hygiene is a concept that we've really talked a lot about in terms of motivating people to have better practices around their own cybersecurity and around having organizations, having better practices around updates and things of that sort. But we could really test cyber hygiene to see whether or not it's beneficial by having that as a strategy within a game. Also put communication practices. I mean, there's a whole field of research in public health around how to do warnings, how to motivate people, because there's a sweet spot. So if you give people too much negative information, they shut down and they don't do the thing. But it's protection motivation theory. But if you give them just the right amount, then they go take the protective behavior. Well, obviously recently we've had a global pandemic, and that really showed that we need to get that messaging just right, and it's hard to do. Well, you can imagine games to deter that where people make rational or irrational choices based on messaging and things of that sort, where we really test some of that out on real humans through game design. We can also use war games, modified war games in context where other experimentation would be unethical. So you think about the disinformation problem that is present in the world today, and will only become more complex to combat, right? Deep fakes, are increasingly accessible to even grossly underfunded groups right now. And once I can do a deep fake on my phone, that changes the game a lot, because we can't even believe what we're seeing. Am I speaking, or is someone putting a mask on and pretending to be me? That's a pretty significant area of concern. But we can't really experiment on people by putting disinformation out in the world in an ethical fashion, right? That's a very tricky study to do in a way that isn't harmful. And so instead we can do it in games. And you can imagine game design changing a little bit, maybe moving into a more virtual space, moving more onto computers in order to study that, but still they're games. And everything that we know about war games applies to those spaces as well. Same with something like refugee policy, where we can't tinker with the refugee policy just to find out what, just to get an experimental result, or just to get some new qualitative information about a topic area. But we can develop a game that changes refugee policy and see how players adapt. You can even imagine something like a large-scale, massively multiplayer version of a game that had a refugee element that we could study. So these are areas that are really exciting to open up and look at in greater detail. And they're all things that we have the tools to do already. Finally, there's things where other experimentation is not so much unethical, it's just impractical. Things like border control, and there are other areas where you just, you can't make the changes that you might make because there are real security concerns, but you can make them in a game and see what happens. So see how it affects people's behavior, see how it works or doesn't work. And so, there are so many spaces that we can apply wargaming to. And so I just really, part of this presentation, the last bit is going to be me going through some mechanics, and then I'll open it up for questions in case anybody has any follow-on. I love to have conversations around these topics. But basically, I really see that we have this incredible toolkit, and I invite you as a member of the community to think about ways that we can apply war games to non-war scenarios, because we have a lot of practice doing conflict games, but there's all kinds of conflicts, and so we can use this level of engagement, this level of rigor, this level of familiarity with strategy that we have always applied, or generally applied, to war footing, and apply it to other areas where there's international competition or communication is necessary. So finally, I'm going to move on to supportive mechanics. So what do I mean by supportive mechanics? Well, I mean, of course, mechanics are the rules of our game, the structure of our game, even the board design, things of that sort. Supportive mechanics, I mean mechanics that facilitate the design of a game, and that lead naturally sort of contribute to a non-war game structure, but where we can still measure and derive findings. So what do I mean by game structure here? Game structure, I'm referring to really the core principle. Are we talking about a competitive game? Are we talking about, every man for himself, or are we talking about something else? So in order to get to some of these other areas where we've been talking about, say, threat sharing, we're going to need to use collaborative games. And so there's not a victor in the sense of, there's red and there's blue and they fight. Rather, people are collaborating to try and achieve a goal. And you either apply a victory condition against some sort of adversary that's notional rather than a red player, or you're working together to resolve some sort of goal. And there's a lot of examples of this in the hobby industry, but you can really see how that could be used in a qualitative setting or even a quantitative setting to look at how people resolve dilemmas. So if we have to collaborate to reach some goals, as with Ascent, then you can kind of see that would be a natural outcome. One versus many games. So the idea that we have one red adversary or one player, and then we have many people collaborating. So it's sort of a hybrid version of collaborative games where there is a big bad, but they're playing over on their own, maybe one or two people on a team, and then everybody else is trying to defeat them. And so that really invites some interesting dynamics. And then finally, scenario-driven games, which is actually what Ascent is. The scenario-driven games give us a lot of flexibility because we can plug in different scenarios in different contexts, and it gives us the flexibility to add nuance as we get new information, and it gives us a real stable format. Actions. So one of the things that we would need in any game, right, is for the ability for people to do things. In war games, often one of those things is attack, right? Attack, defend, move troops around. One of the things that we really found as we were talking about Ascent and trying to deal with these other avenues within Ascent was that trade and resource sharing was really important, because that was how we would, one, it was very reflective of reality, and two, it was very useful for having measures for things that you could measure success or failure because trades went through or didn't, resources were shared or they weren't. And then making table talk an explicit action is, I think, hugely valuable because you can measure it and you can report it. So right now in many TTXs, we're, you just have a note taker in the room, and that's, it's absolutely important and useful. And I don't mean to in any way disparage that kind of research. Observational research is very important, but making table talk an explicit action can codify the cost of it and make it something that you can track in a very track readily. And so particularly in games where you're looking at communication or consensus, I think that it's very valuable. Scenarios that we might apply this to: non-war competition, pre or post-conflict collaboration, or peace. So when I say wargaming when war is not the answer, I'm really talking about the wargame community and the idea that we can apply all our wargame tools to these other conflicts. So I don't mean so much war is not the answer within the game itself. I mean war is not the answer within the larger context. We're not looking at a situation that war can solve. We're looking at a situation that that we need a different toolkit where we need to tune up our tools in a different way and apply them in a different way. Non-war competition is, of course, a big one, but even pre and post-conflict collaboration resolutions around things like the placement and movement of refugees, about reclaiming and restoring land that's been damaged. You can imagine a game about negotiation of the about the removal of landmines. I mean, there's a lot of spaces where where the sort of war adjacent spaces that I think it would be quite useful. And then finally, victory conditions. So progress to a desired goal at game end or victory points for desired behavior are kind of, seem to me to be the best victory conditions for this kind of game, because obviously we're not doing, area control in the traditional sense that you would see in a war game, but you're seeing behaviors that you want to encourage. And so tying your victory conditions to those behaviors really gets to sort of encouraging rational play. And so if people aren't working towards those victory conditions, then you can see that there's some sort of human behavioral dynamic coming into play. So those are supportive mechanics. They're not the only ones. There are obviously lots and lots of kinds of mechanics that can come into play. And some of these are more appropriate specifically for analytical wargaming because, for instance, making table talk explicit allows me to count it in a way that might be useful in quantitative research, but not so much in qualitative research, where it might be more important to allow people to speak freely and just capture that through either recording or note taking. So I do acknowledge that some of these are driven a bit by my own methodology, but I do think that it's a useful set, and would be happy to talk more with anybody about how to apply these things.
Okay, Dr. Booth, thank you. There's been some questions in the chat, and I've got a couple of them here. One of them, there are non-war games, war games, and are these non-war games serious games? Like, where do you come down on the war game versus serious game divide?
Right. Okay, so that's an interesting question. Again, I think to clarify my title a little bit, I'm not so much asserting that they are war games. They are non-war war games in the sense that they are games made by wargamers. I really am calling on the community to look at all the ways that we can apply our skills to other war adjacent spaces. I do think of war games as a form of serious game. So serious games are the big umbrella, and war games are a subset within that. I know that there's a lot of nuance in how people use serious games. Educational games, war games, all the spread of difference. But to me, I'm really, when I say, wargaming when war is not the answer, what I'm really calling upon is the wargame community to apply our skills to that space. I think that the wargame community is incredibly rigorous, and we have a different toolkit than, say, a lot of the serious games are in educational spaces or in training spaces, and that's wonderful. But that's not the kind of work I'm talking about. I'm really talking about games to measure and assess policy and behavior. And so that's more our wheelhouse than it is theirs in large part. And so I think that we should take advantage of that.
How about you made a distinction early on between analytic war games and experimental war games. What's your difference there?
Basically, the difference there is that experimental war games involve the manipulation of an independent variable to get an effect on a dependent variable. I can imagine scenarios in which we're still counting and doing doing quantitative analysis, but where we're not doing that. So you can sort of imagine scenarios where we're moved out of the qualitative space, and so we are doing things like counting behaviors, counting time to reach consensus, but we're not comparing it in that strict experimental sense. And so, for instance, we're looking at how long it takes people to reach consensus in a particular game, and that's something that we're studying in order to find a grounding to answer some other question. Or are there patterns that people tend to go through? So does consensus or strategy or victory move through a specific number of phases? And so if so, that would still potentially be quantitative work, but not experimental.
There was some discussion in the Discord on the continuum of non-war to war. Do you see this leading into more traditional war games, or do you see this as having a place looking particularly just at that non-war, pre-war kind of period in isolation?
Yeah, I think we've looked a lot at, I think our war game design really does a great job in the community. There have been wonderful games that move us from sort of pre-war setting into war. I think there's definitely a continuum. There must be, because there's a continuum between war and non-war in reality. And so the extent to which we create games that have fidelity to reality, I think that is going to be present. I do caution that I think that for some of these contexts, it's useful to set a boundary that excludes war. Just as in wargaming, we sometimes set boundaries that exclude certain types of war. So we might have a game that has a nuclear capacity over here and a game that doesn't over there. We might have a game that includes cyber and a game that doesn't. In the same way, I think that some of these concepts are really usefully framed without war, even though, in a way they are, as I say, war adjacent. And so I think that's quite valuable. But I absolutely agree. It is a spectrum. And I think that thinking about how we can move sometimes left of war on the spectrum, such that we can understand a little bit more about precursors, or that we move, post-war, to look at recovery, which is an area that sometimes I think that we falter a little bit in post-war recovery efforts in terms of restabilizing a region after war. The international community. And so, so I think it is a spectrum, and it's something that we can usefully study the ends of, not just the middle where war lives.
Great. When you talk about experimental games, and you had talking about like large N data, how often do you get to do actual multiple iterations to get it, greater amounts of data on the same within the same set of runs? And are there what do the commonalities and divergences tell you?
Oh, great question. So first of all, this gets back to something that I was talking about at the very beginning, which is about how expensive war games can be. We have been incredibly fortunate within the Pegasus group at Sandia that we've had consistent funding for some games for an extended period. So the Signal game that was the precursor to some stuff we're working on now, we were able to get into a very large data set. That's a privilege. That is a real, it's good fortune, and it's good funding, but that's not going to be there for everybody. And so I do want to acknowledge that when you do get to run through multiple iterations, it's important and valuable. But obviously, games can tell us things when we only run through them a few times. But when you do get multiple iterations, you tend to see behavioral skew. Not skew. You tend to see the behavioral range, and I think we can really speak to commonalities between data sets, and the divergences that we can analyze. In an experimental setting, you can analyze statistically. And so that's wonderful. I can't really speak to what they tell us in terms of in a general way, but because it's always going to be based on the game and the context and who are participating. But one of the things that it can do, for instance, is we could test some of the lab effects. So there's a lot of discussion around expert samples versus non-expert. And so that's something that when you run through multiple iterations of the same game, you can actually test, right? Did the experts, we have 50 playthroughs with experts and 50 playthroughs without, we can compare them and see if there are statistically significant divergences there. And that in and of itself is interesting, because it's interesting just to know. It's also important because it allows us to create documentation about our method and how our method works in a way that I think is important.
Yeah, that documentation piece, I bemoan the fact that given how few of us, particularly where I am, we get to either do games or write about the games we do, and the next one comes along before we have the chance to do the writing on the one we did. So anytime we get to document ourselves for our posterity, I think we are doing a disservice if we fail to do that, which means I'm in great disservice.
We really do have to balance, as game creators and as people who work for for these various agencies. We really have to balance the benefits of getting the information and getting it to our clients or our bosses versus writing it up and getting it out into the academic community. And so I think it's one of the reasons why conversations like this are important. I think it's one of the reasons why events like this are so important, because even if we can't write it up, we can at least sort of do some information sharing, which I think is very valuable.
You had mentioned earlier on about sort of some ideas you had about tools potentially for assisting in game design. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we're actually working at Sandia on a platform, and we don't yet know how accessible that will be to others, but we're basically working on a game design platform that that would allow us, it's sort of oriented towards wargame design. And so one of the things that I think is really valuable is to work as a community on projects where we have these shared tools. Obviously there are things like Tabletop Simulator that exist out in the world, but that we can't use in a lot of settings, right? Because there are constraints around military use, there are constraints around national security use of things that live on the cloud and you can buy on Steam or whatever, right? So either we get versions of that are that meet our security needs, or we design our own, right, as a community. And so I think that that's that's a space that can be very beneficial. I mean, obviously we can all still just design games in our offices on, we can print them out and make board games. Like that's the thing we've been doing for decades, if not centuries. But it's nice to be able to do it in a distributed environment. And so like we're big proponents for virtual games because we feel like it allows us to get them out there in a really good and meaningful way. But to do that, we have to have tools to do it. And so that's something that we're focused on in the long term.
Excellent. You obviously have seen my office with my table with my paper maps and wooden blocks. And
I mean, I have drawers and drawers of little meeples, it's like,
yep,
why
yep.
not? Hey, something comes into the house and it goes through two processes. Do I need it? And can I use it in a game design? And that's, that's the love of the thing, right? I mean, I think we're here because we're passionate about it.
It is. How can we take advantage of we talk about massive multiplayer,
Right.
for some value of massive.
Right.
We tend not to be nearly, for us, hundreds is massive, not millions, like out in the wild. But I think, what are your thoughts on sort of the data collection, data curation aspect of how do you have when you try to get at the naive users versus expert users? Do you formulate a survey that you give the players
Yes.
before they play? I know the nuclear game, the other game your folks work with, were doing
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Signal.
Yeah.
Do you see? One of the things that's kind of always this try. There seems to be a cadre of folks out there that are very interested in collaborating with the professional community. And I know for a few games like Command Modern Operations, there's a very robust sort of user community. Do you see that kind of a user community thing going beyond just supporting individual games to trying to do a more robust sort of a government, non-government kind of a partnering? Is there a way you think that could be done that we can share these different databases of players we've had, or is that kind of a bridge too far?
I mean, that's a good and interesting question. I think one of the things that I see a couple of problems that are in our way, which doesn't mean that they're not resolvable. But one, of course, is because this is research, right, and not a market product, we have a lot of restrictions. I mean, most war games are human subject research in one way or another, and so we have to go through IRBs, and we have to be very constrained about what we use the data for, and constrained about our participant lists. But I've seen that overcome in academia by having people sign up for like a general service where they say, I would like, I'm open to participating, and here's my name and information, and so you sort of share it around. And it was used very effectively in one of the universities that I went to as a way of getting participants. And so you sort of got on a mailing list, and if something came across the desk that looked cool and you wanted to do it, you went and did it. And so you can see that being attractive from a game design, like for gamers who want to try new things, where it's like, oh yeah, sure, you want to, like, I can get in on these cool military designed games. Like, yeah, absolutely, sign me up. To do that, we would need funding for for outreach, right? Which is a little tricky. The other option, the other obstacle that I see is just right communication between groups. Like, because a lot of the work that we do is we can report on it to a certain extent, but there's not this open full sharing for a lot of reasons, but confidentiality, I mean, classification being like the number one. And then finally, y'all, sometimes our games aren't fun. And
oh, you wound me. You wound me.
I mean, sometimes they're very useful for the application, but they're not fun. And so I know that's a thing that we work on, and we try and make them fun, but sometimes the application is so narrow that it's just really hard to make them fun. And so I don't know if we could develop an entertainment ranking so that the games that were more enjoyable we could get out there, and we could sort of say, hey, like, this one's a narrow purpose, interesting game, but like, it's not as its engagement factor is a little lower versus some others. And just acknowledge that, right? Because it's not like players aren't going to notice once they're playing it.
Gee, what if there was this group of people that got together online from all around the world, watching each other on YouTube, exchanging these great ideas?
Right?
Nah, that would never work.
Happen.
That would never work. Here's one from the chat. Do you always run your games with different players for the same purpose, or are there some games for different purposes, or do you modify existing games?
So let's see. Do we run? Okay, this is several questions, but all to a point. All right. So do you run your games with different players for the same purpose? Yes. I mean, not only have we done that, but I think that other people in the community have done that, right? I know Jackie Snyder has done that because I saw her talk about it. But yes, I mean, like expert, non-expert samples, you can sort of see that you would run with different player types to look at the results, and you can compare across and see how generalizable those non-expert findings were going to be based on whether or not there was a significant divergence between the two groups. The same games for different purposes is a little harder. But, as I was saying, if you change out scenarios, you can really do that. And even with Ascent, right? Like, we had two different purposes. So we were running it, you could imagine opening that up. So, if we're a future state to exist where we wanted to study conflict escalation and de-escalation, you can imagine deploying a game like that out into the wild a bit, similar to how we did something like Signal. And then, it would still be serving the purpose within NATO of the practice of consent, but over here it could be serving an experimental purpose. So yeah, I think absolutely you can use the same games for different purposes. As for modifying existing games to achieve certain goals, not only do I think we should do that, but that's part of, I think, what's going to make us faster and more flexible as a community is when we design games with reuse in mind. So when we design games saying, okay, I can take this mechanic from here, I can take this design document from here, I can plug these different parts together, and I can make a new game, but it runs just like the existing game, but it's got a new skin, or it's got it's got kind of an expansion pack that makes it relevant to some other setting, or I've swapped out some scenarios. And that's something that we see in the hobby community all the time, right? Games that are basically exactly the same game, but there's a fantasy version versus a zombie version. Like, I'm thinking of a specific, there's Thunderstone, and then I can't remember the name of the zombie.
How many different love letters are there? There's like 15.
Oh my God, right? Or Flux, right? There's a billion of them. Munchkin. And so, and people, that's a trivial difference, right? Like, that's a skin, but you can see difference there with like, switching out scenarios and taking something from, something as simple as like a Ticket to Ride, where you go from a US map to a European map, but you start to see some of the pressures around a European map that are quite different. And so we could do that with our games. And I'm not saying that nobody does. I'm just saying that I think that that's a useful area, because we do want to keep the costs of war game design low so that we can make them a valid and useful, so we can continue to be a valid and useful tool outside of very high dollar environments.
So you've done these games, you've got different, maybe hundreds of people. What's the most surprising thing, or the thing that you least expected to sort of come out of this that you found so far?
Oh gosh, the most surprising thing. All right, it's just us here.
Just us. There's
Just
like you and I and 12 people and the potential billions who will watch this after the fact, realizing what they've missed. But right now, it's just you and I.
It's just us. All right. So, strategic thinkers and political scientists are often really bad at games, y'all.
No.
Really bad. I mean,
I'm shocked.
Like, complexity in our games is a problem because people who do this real world for a living sometimes have a hard time with games that abstract their behaviors, and that always shocks me. I mean, I know that it's not like a real finding, but it was fascinating to me when I moved into this space that games that answer these big questions often have to be so simple. And I think that parsimony and elegance in design is one of the things that makes wargaming challenging, and what makes a good wargame design and good wargames designers so valuable. So yeah,
that is that's something we'll just keep between you and I here. We won't let that out. But it's interesting, the whole simplicity thing. I find the trying to distill the essence of a decision-making situation down into just, the it's so hard. And when you get it, it seems that the people who should most appreciate it are the ones that immediately dismiss it because of that. Oh, it's too simple to really be realistic, or, so I find that's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing. Have you run into that?
I'm reminded of a story that I heard once about someone applying for tenure. It was a brilliant researcher, well respected, highly published in his field, and he went before the tenure board, and the outside tenure staff, because you have the people from your department or your people from your college, and then you have some people from outside. And the outside reviewer said, well, I don't think he deserves tenure because I can understand what his research is about. And I think that we have that problem a little bit. The games, when the games are really complicated, I think that that actually has a muting effect on the ability to find significance, right? On the ability to make statements about what people are doing, because the game's really complex and people may or may not be actually seeing the real scenario, the correct strategic choices for their aims. So it's hard to extrapolate what they were trying to do. But on the other hand, you've got games that are very simple that get to the heart of some of these choices that seem too simple. And so yeah, and I think that we all face that to one degree or another. And one of the things that's going to be, I keep coming back to it, but we've got to publish about lab effects. We've got to publish about how these things compare to historical events, how they compare to other experimental designs, because it's so important that we get good data out there. And I think that war games are such a sweet spot. They really are. We keep the human in the loop there, but it's not just kind of a disengaged process of doing a survey. And it's very, we're not trying to read the tea leaves of the past as frequently happens, where we're trying to say, oh well, that happened because it was a Tuesday and a full moon, and Napoleon had hemorrhoids. It's like, no, we're really seeing like the thing, and yes, it's an abstract layer, but I think part of it is just persuasive arguing, and a body of research behind us is going to make it a lot easier to make those points. And I know we have research. I'm not saying that people aren't publishing. I'm just saying that like as we take these obstacles head on, I think that that's going to be a really valuable way forward. The extent to which we can see those objections, acknowledge them, and then publish exhaustive research about how that's actually not the reality that we're experiencing, I think will be what keeps us relevant.
Agree. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour here, and I will give you the opportunity. I know it's just been us here. But assuming that those 6 billion other people come and watch this, what is your parting shot? What is your big, from my experience, if I could say 30-second elevator speech to all the wargamers out there, here's your chance.
Yeah, absolutely. So take your skills, which you've applied to war, and apply them to whatever the other big problem in the world that you see is. Wargaming can be applied to anything. Games can solve anything. Your skill sets, which have been so useful in this specific area, can be applied to any part of that chain and to any context. And so I would really invite people to take our skills and apply them to other problems. And thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I feel like we've just had this nice chat with each other. I've learned so much. Thank you again. And I look forward to seeing you more frequently at Connections, because you've been a great contributor here. And I'm sure we'll continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you.